Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of Digital Fate. I'm Richie, this is Capricorn, and today I have my top 10 picks from the AetherDrift expansion. These are the 10 most powerful cards that I think will impact Magic in the biggest ways. I'll mostly be talking about Standard, but I will be referencing other formats when it becomes relevant, and I will be talking about Limited to a certain extent as well. And in regards to that, I'm going to give you my thoughts on my top 5 picks for uncommons, my very best pick for common, and there's sure to be some honorable mentions along the way, so strap in. We're going to start the video with just a few cards that I think should maybe possibly be on this list, except without testing them first, we don't really know how high the ceilings are, so I'm going to leave them off my top 10, but all of these cards at the beginning are things that I think could impact different formats, especially Standard, in huge ways that could end up being meta-defining, but could also just as easily whiff and see no play at all. And I think it's important to at least mention those cards before we get to the actual best of lists. Now, before we dive in, make sure you like the video. It helps me get the video out to so many more people. It helps the channel to grow, and I appreciate that immensely. Also, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an upload. I have some crazy deck techs on the way. Speaking of which, I have been invited to be a part of the AetherDrift Early Access event that's happening on Wednesday, February 5th, just in a few days from now. I'll be doing a 24-hour marathon stream starting at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'm not going to stop. I have like 12 different deck ideas that are absolutely insane that we are going to run on the ranked ladder against other content creators and see if we can send them all home crying to their mommies. We'll see if we can do it. Also, if you have ideas that you want to see me try in this set, join me live for that. That's happening at twitch.tv/quarantinecapricorn, because if I'm alive and I'm breathing, I'm there and I'm streaming. Come hang out at any point during the 24 hours, and if you want to see certain card combinations, certain deck ideas, we can try them out live on stream, and you'll know if they work or not, and you'll know if you should craft those cards as soon as the set launches that next Tuesday. So I'll see you there, but with all of that out of the way, let's just dig into these cards. So first off, I want to mention some cards that, like I said before, I think have the potential to be absolutely insane, but it's so hard to know right now. The first of which is Radiant Lotus. 6 mana, artifact, tap, sack one or more artifacts, choose a color, target player adds 3 mana of the chosen color for each artifact sacrificed this way. 6 mana is a lot. It might be too much. I don't know if it is. But this has the potential to give you a ton of mana, especially when you use it in conjunction with artifact tokens and stuff like that. So it is definitely possible for there to be some kind of ridiculous combo deck that just slams this and then plays out their whole hand, completely gasses up. That being said, there are already plenty of decks in Standard that allow you to cheat out Omniscience super early, so I don't know if it's worth it to jump through the hoops for something like Radiant Lotus, but the potential is definitely there, and I'm sure some content creator will find something absolutely ridiculous to do with this card. The real question is it good enough to be relevant in the Standard meta? We'll find out. If you have ideas in particular about this one, let me know in the comments. The other one I want to mention is Vinwexit Verbose Host. This is a 0/4 legendary homunculus for 1 blue and 1, has start your engines, you have no maximum hand size, and at max speed, if you would draw a card, you draw 2 cards instead. I think this one's flying under the radar a little bit because the ceiling is absolutely gross, and this card has the potential to just be absolutely bananas. Like the absolute... I guess it all depends on how quickly and how efficiently you can get to max speed. If it turns out through testing that you can get to max speed very quickly and very consistently, this guy's going to be insane, because if you're just at max speed and then you drop him, well, now for the rest of the game, every card you draw is 2 cards. That means no matter what, the card you draw for turn is going to be a second card, which is kind of like a Phyrexian Arena that costs 1 less mana and doesn't cost you a life, except it's way better than that because it's literally every card you draw. So if you draw a card from a spell, you'll draw 2. If you draw 2 cards from a spell, you'll draw 4. If you draw 3 cards from a spell, you'll draw 6, and you're still drawing an extra card when you draw for turn. All of that's insane, and then it gets even crazier if you're using loot effects. If you get to draw discard, you now get to draw 2 discard, which means you turn a loot effect into a draw effect as well as the loot effect, which is actually pretty substantial, maybe even more important than just turning draw a card into draw 2, because it's so much easier and so much more efficient to get loot effects to happen. They don't cost as much as an actual draw effect, which means you're getting a lot more bang for your buck out of that. So there's just a lot of potential for this guy to be absolutely bananas. Just complete and utter gas. You don't even have to put him out there and risk him dying early in the game. You just wait until you have max speed, slam him, and then play all your crazy card draw spells. And even if they kill him at that point, you're all gassed up. Question is, how quickly and how reliably can we get to max speed? And we don't have the answer to that yet, so I'm excited to find out. Another one I want to talk about is Market Back Walker. At first glance, this looks really expensive. Double X for a 0/0. It enters with X +1/+1 counters, and you can pay a whopping 4 mana to put a +1/+1 counter on it. But the last line of text is what's super relevant. When this creature dies, draw a card for each +1/+1 counter on it. I think this has potential in ways that aren't being thought of, because it is really expensive if you're trying to use it fairly and you're trying to have it be a big, impactful creature on the field. But you can just play this for 2 mana as a 1/1 that when it dies draws you a card, which is already kind of good. But where it gets really nutty is in the +1/+1 counter deck. If you have other ways of putting +1/+1 counters on this, that's a lot cheaper and a lot more efficient than having to pay double X when you first play it. Then you could just pile this thing up with counters and potentially draw a ton off of it when it dies very easily. So it really depends on how good the +1/+1 counter deck is, or maybe the sacrifice deck is, because you play this on 2 and then sack it, and if there's some kind of a deck that hybridizes both of those archetypes into the same deck, it would be perfect for this. And those are all question marks right now. We just don't know how relevant all of that stuff's going to be. But the Market Back Walker has a chance to be insanely powerful in decks like that, so we'll have to wait and see. Next up, we've got 𝑇𝑒𝑟𝑟𝑎𝑛 Rocketeer Engineer, 1 red and 4 for a legendary Goblin Artificer with 5 toughness and star power. His power is equal to the greatest mana value among artifacts you control, which seems like it's not that great because you have to spend more mana to get more power. But whenever 𝑇𝑒𝑟𝑟𝑎𝑛 enters or attacks, you choose target artifact card in your graveyard. You may sacrifice an artifact. If you do, return the chosen card to the battlefield. I think this one has a lot of potential, and a lot of people have forgotten about this one because it was one of the first cards spoiled way back when they announced the set. And people kind of forgotten about it recently, I think. But being able to sacrifice like a map token to get a portal to Phyrexia out of the graveyard that you get to keep no matter what, and then 𝑇𝑒𝑟𝑟𝑎𝑛's power becomes 9, and if they don't kill 𝑇𝑒𝑟𝑟𝑎𝑛, then it gets to swing and do it again and again and again. So it's like, even if they do want to kill 𝑇𝑒𝑟𝑟𝑎𝑛, they have to kill the crazy artifact you got back. But if they kill the crazy artifact that you got back, then they might not have the mana or the cards left to deal with 𝑇𝑒𝑟𝑟𝑎𝑛 as well. Chances are they can't deal with both things at the same time. But if they don't, they're probably dead. If they don't deal with the bomb artifact, they're toast. If they don't deal with 𝑇𝑒𝑟𝑟𝑎𝑛, you just get back the bomb artifacts. So I feel like there's potential for this to be insane in a lot of ways that people just are kind of sleeping on. But we're really not going to know until we're able to test it out. We just don't know how good the artifact deck can be, or what kind of lines we can set up that let us make a play like that. So it's going to require a lot of testing, but 𝑇𝑒𝑟𝑟𝑎𝑛's another one that could come out of nowhere and be kind of bananas. We've also got Salvation Engine, and this one specifically I want to point out almost made the top 10 list just because of its implications in older formats where Greasefang decks are very popular. This card's insane in Greasefang. It is a 6/10 vehicle, cruise for 6 for 1 white and 4. Whenever it attacks, you return up to 1 target artifact card from your graveyard to the battlefield, just straight up. But also, other artifact creatures you control get +2/+2. So in Greasefang, the idea is, instead of just bringing back the giant vehicle you would normally bring back with Greasefang, you bring back the Salvation Engine instead. The Salvation Engine brings back the other huge vehicle, and then that other huge vehicle now gets to stay forever and doesn't have to get bounced back to your hand. Instead, the Salvation Engine does. And that sounds really, really awesome. The one thing about this card that makes it seem a little bit underwhelming is how it's a Cruise 6, which is a lot. so it seems like it's going to be really, really hard to reuse this later on in the game to actually attack with it and get that trigger outside of Greasefang doing his thing, which is why I was a little hesitant about it actually making an impact in Standard. But the one thing to keep in mind is the fact that it also has that double Anthem effect for artifact creatures. So theoretically, if you had two 1/1 like Thopter tokens or Gnome tokens or whatever, two 1/1 artifact creature tokens, they would both become 3/3s, and you'd only have to tap the two 1/1s basically to crew the Salvation Engine. So when you start to think of it like that, it seems way more reasonable in a deck that's specifically focused on artifacts in a big way. So yeah, I think this actually does have a chance in Standard. It definitely has a chance in older formats, but it really remains to be seen. You're gonna have to test, you know, with the older formats. There's so little wiggle room for new cards that it's hard to know if adding a card like this is gonna mess with the way it curves out. And with Standard, it's hard to know right now if the artifact decks are gonna be relevant enough because it's gonna be such a new archetype that really doesn't exist in the meta right now. So I think it has a chance, it has a lot of potential, but we're going to have to see. Also, Ovia, Automech Artisan. This card is here for one reason and one reason only, because as I've been saying in pretty much every video for this entire spoiler season, Agatha's Soul Cauldron is going to be completely broken. And I think if you're trying to use Ovia, Automech Artisan in a fair way, she's not broken. Like, she's good, but I don't think she's good enough to make like the top 10 list or anything like that. She gives, you know, each creature that's attacking one of your opponent's trample, which is really nice, gets even better with multiplayer. She has this ability to like Elvish Piper, pay 1 tap, put a creature or vehicle, so a little bit better than Piper, from your hand onto the battlefield. And if it's an artifact you put there, it gets 2+1/+1 counters, so better than Piper in that way. For all intents and purposes, it's just a strictly better Elvish Piper, which is good. It's just not top 10 good. But the reason why I still kind of want to mention it here and keep it in mind is literally Agatha's Soul Cauldron. If you exile this with a Soul Cauldron, and now every single one of your creatures with a +1/+1 counter gets the ability to just pay 1, tap, put any creature or vehicle from your hand into play, and any artifact creature put into play that way gets +1/+1 counters, which immediately turns on all of the abilities from Agatha's Soul Cauldron for whatever you just put into play. All of that seems bananas, and I truly think that Soul Cauldron has a chance to be completely broken. Completely broken in the new Standard. And if that's the case, I'm sure Ovia will be a big part of that. And we're absolutely going to make that deck on Early Access Day for sure. It's going to be one of the first decks we try to brew, is just see how crazy we can go with Breaking Cauldron. And there's actually a few different Cauldron decks that I'm thinking about making, so I'm not sure which one I'm going to play first. But regardless, Ovia could be bananas if the Cauldron decks end up being that good, as good as I think they might be. And speaking of the Cauldron decks, if they do end up being that good, another good card that didn't quite make the top 10 list is Thunderous Velocipede, a 3-mana 5/5 artifact vehicle with trample that crews for 3. Each other vehicle and creature you control enters with an additional +1/+1 counter on it if its mana value is 4 or less. Otherwise, it enters with 3 +1/+1 counters on it. This is already going to be good for go-wide decks. Every single creature and vehicle that enters comes with counters, gets bigger. Plus, it's a relevant 5/5 trampler that crews for 3 for only 3 mana, and your big stuff comes in with an insane amount of counters. Like, everything about this card is really, really good. But with Agatha's Soul Cauldron, every single creature is now going to enter automatically picking up every ability from the Soul Cauldron right out of the gate. You don't have to worry about how do you get counters onto it or anything. So it might be win more, it might be too cute, or the card might be good enough on its own regardless that it doesn't matter if it's too cute and play it anyway. It might end up being insane. It's really hard to know without testing, but the Velocipede has a chance to be crazy in those Soul Cauldron decks in the same way that Ovia does. But that brings us to our very first honorable mention for best common, and that goes to Light Wheel Enhancements. And the reason is very, well, maybe not so obvious. 1 white mana for an enchantment aura, enchants a creature or vehicles, has start your engines, enchanted permanent gets +1/+1 in vigilance. All of that's irrelevant. Max speed, you may cast this card from your graveyard. So, if you have a sacrifice outlet for enchantments and you're at max speed, you can sacrifice Light Wheel enhancements and replay it for 1, and sack it and replay it for 1, and sack it and replay it for 1, until the end of time, which is insane and has to be abusable. The question is it abusable enough in the formats where it's going to matter? And that's hard to say. But even if you're just playing this fairly, once you get to max speed, just for the rest of the game, anytime they kill something this enchants, you can always recast it. Always. For the rest of the game. You can never lose max speed. I lied. There's one card in the set that can potentially tick your speed down by 1. But other than that card, nothing can make you lose your speed. So for the rest of the game, this can just always be played from your graveyard for 1 white mana with no other hoops to jump through. You're not limited to like only being able to do it once a turn or any of that stuff. Just insane. Can be just crazy, especially in the decks that care about enchantments and going wide with enchantments, where playing enchantments is going to matter that much more. I think this has a chance to show up in like aura style decks in older formats maybe. Just a lot of value in this card, and I think it's kind of a sleeper. But another common I want to talk about that I have to say is my pick for best specifically in Limited is Hazard of the Dunes. This is my top pick for Limited for a common. It is 1 green and 3 for a 4/4 worm with trample and reach, and it has an exhaust ability, 1 green and 6, put 3 +1/+1 counters on this creature. This is just hands down the best common. We'd normally see uncommons that are statted like this back in the day. Now we have a common that's easy to pick up later on in a draft and just gives you all the stats you want on your 4-drop, but in addition to that, if you get to a point later on where you have extra mana sitting around, it's a mana sink that turns this into a literal game ender. The fact that you have a 7/7 trample reacher in your deck without the drawbacks that would normally come with having to keep a giant 7/7 trample reacher in your hand until you get enough mana to play it is kinda nuts, because you play it on curve, on rate, for 4 mana, and it's really good at doing what you want it to do for now. Whether you're attacking with it or blocking with it, it does both super well because of the trample and the reach. And then eventually you get your big bomb anyway. It's just not stuck in your hand forever while you wait to get there, which is just amazing. So as a common, specifically for Limited, I think this is the best common in the set. But the one common that I think has the most potential, the best common for Standard or potentially other constructed formats even outside of Standard, is Magmakin Artillerist. This is a 1/4 elemental pirate for 1 red and 2. Whenever you discard 1 or more cards, this creature deals that much damage to each opponent. It cycles for 1 red and 1, and when you cycle this card, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. This card's absurd. I can't believe it's a common. It is an absolute slam dunk in any cycling deck, whether it's a Limited deck, whether it's a Standard deck, which it's absolutely going to be a thing in Standard once this set drops, so be ready for that. We'll talk about that more later. Or even in older cycling decks, I think this card has a chance to see play, which is crazy for a common, right? Crazy for a common in a new Standard legal set. But this card just has everything you want. It's got a decent butt, so it can help, survive the race against aggro. The triggers are insane if you get this down early. Just everything you discard is just doing extra damage. And if you're piling this on top of all of your other discard payoffs, it matters that much more. But not only that, if you top deck this later in the game, you can cycle it away itself, triggering all your other cycling payoffs, all of your other discard payoffs, whether it's a Magmakin Artillerist that's already down, or some of the other things that we've seen, which are going to come up a little bit later in this video. The Magmakin Artillerist just is insane. And then if you do cycle it, you get to deal an extra damage as well, just cuz. So if you cycle this while you already have one in play, you deal 2 for 2 mana and draw a card. And that's not even talking about all of the other potential discard triggers you can get. There's a lot of cards in this set that trigger off of discards. And I really think that deck is going to be insane in Standard, but it's even going to be really good in Limited. And this guy's going to be a key part of the Limited deck for sure. And I'm almost positive this sees play in the Standard version of Cycling, like 100%. Card's just nuts. But the very last common I want to talk about is my all-around pick for best common in the set, taking both Limited and Standard into account, and that's Grim Bauble. This is 1 black for an artifact. When it enters, target creature an opponent controls gets -2/-2 until end of turn, and you can pay 3 mana, tap, and sack it to Surveil 2. This is good for so many reasons. First of all, it doesn't have to be enchanted or equipped onto a creature to make that creature get -2/-2. So, you don't lose the bauble when the creature dies, similar to certain enchantment auras that we've gotten in the past that do the same -2/-2 for 1 mana. You get to keep the bauble around. And because Nurturing Pixie decks are all the rage right now, being able to have a 1 mana artifact that does -2/-2 that can then be bounced to your hand and recast to kill something else later for only 1 mana is kind of nuts. It counts as a permanent that you can sacrifice for all of the sacrifice decks. Rakdos Sacrifice specifically in Standard is going to love this card. And it counts as an artifact, so if you're in the artifact deck trying to go wide with artifact synergies, you can get your removal and still keep your artifact on the board to contribute to those synergies. So there are a lot of different decks that want to use this, both in Standard and in Limited. And on top of all of that, it's got this extra gas that if you need to, you can just sack it to Surveil 2. Is there anything this card doesn't do? It's just that good. And I'm gonna be testing it out in a bunch of stuff, honestly. The Rakdos Sack deck with Rottenmouth Viper, the Nurturing Pixie deck for sure, the Artifact deck. Card's just really good. Pick it and draft and play with it. But we're gonna move on. We're gonna move on to the uncommons, and we're gonna start with my pick for what I think is gonna be specifically the best. This isn't one of my top 5 of the uncommons, but it's an honorable mention for specifically the best card in Limited, best uncommon card in Limited, and I think that goes to Sabotage Strategist. This is a 2/2 Vedalken Ranger with flying and vigilance for 2 blue and 2. Whenever 1 or more creatures attack you, those creatures get -1/-0 until end of turn, and it also has an exhaust ability, pay 2 blue and 5, a total of 7 mana, which is a lot, to put 3 +1/+1 counters on this creature. Now, when I first saw this, I thought it was pretty good, but I didn't think it was really good enough. It seemed a little expensive and a little slow. The exhaust ability is really expensive. It was good for sure, but I didn't think it was quite as good as I think it is now. But the more I started to sit on this card and really think about it, I was like, man, this card does so much. First of all, because every creature attacking you gets -1 power, this thing can block 2 power creatures swinging in at you. And since it has vigilance, it can attack while still blocking 2 power creatures that swing in at you. And it has flying, which means it can attack evasively in the air, get through for damage to win the race, while still being a blocker for a 2 power creature and not dying. And in addition to all of that, all of your blockers can now block an additional power creature without dying because of the ability on this. And the ones that don't get blocked are getting through for 1 less damage anyway, even if you don't want to block, because maybe you will have to trade, or you will have to chump, or whatever the case may be. And when you start to take all of that into account, and the fact that all of that is happening at the same time, you realize just how much this card helps you to win races to an insane degree. And then you look at the exhaust ability, and sure, there are going to be plenty of games where you don't get to enough mana to pay for that exhaust ability, but it's extra, right? It's just there. If you ever get to 7 mana, well, now you have a 5/5 flying vigilance creature. You're attacking for 5 every turn and blocking almost anything. You can block a 5 power flyer and survive it because of the -1/-0 ability and still swing back for 5 in the air every turn. It's just crazy, man. Like, the more I think about this card, the more ridiculous I think it is. Absolutely my pick. I could be wrong, but I think I'm pretty close to right here, if not right on the nose. Best uncommon for limited. But that brings us to a sleeper that I think has the potential to be insane, but just like the other cards I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I'm not 100% sure where the ceiling lies for a card like this, so we're going to have to test it to really know, and that's Ranger's Refueler. 1 blue and 1 for a 3/3 artifact vehicle. It crews for 2. Whenever you activate an exhaust ability, you draw a card, and exhaust for 4, this vehicle becomes an artifact creature, put a +1/+1 counter on it. So I look at this, and the ceiling tells me this potentially has the potential to be the next, like, up the beanstalk in a way. It's a 2-mana permanent that can't be destroyed with creature removal that's going to draw you a card every time you do a thing with your mana that it wants you to do. Whereas with Up the Beanstalk, it's you have to play something that costs 5 or more, and you have to kind of try to jump through the hoops of finding ways to play things for less mana while them still being things that cost 5 or more. With this card, I think there's kind of less hoops to jump through. You just have to use an exhaust ability, and it's really dependent upon how good the exhaust deck ends up being. And if you can have enough exhaust in your deck and constantly using it, every single exhaust ability now becomes a cantrip is kind of nuts. And also you get the body that eventually you can just pay 4 to not only turn this into a 4/4, but also it's a 4/4 that draws you a card when you do it, since it triggers its own ability. And that's really good too. And even just a 3/3 that can be crewed in the meantime is also kind of good. Just everything that this card does is really, really good. But it really depends on how good the exhaust deck ends up being. The better the exhaust deck, the more realistic that deck ends up being, the better this card gets. And the ceiling of that is it does have the potential to be kind of like another Up the Beanstalk. Now, it doesn't draw you a card as soon as you play it, but it does draw you a card from itself later on with the exhaust ability. So even though it's not up front, it does still have that built-in ability to draw a card even without some other card interacting with it. So yeah, it'll be interesting. I think Up the Beanstalk gets you a little bit more right away, obviously, but this has a lot more potential for the long term, I think. And yeah, we're gonna have to see where it goes. But that brings me to my actual honorable mention for the uncommons, which is Sky Serpent Seeker. This is a 2-mana 1/1 with flying and death touch in the colors of Simic. That alone is going to be nuts in limited. Like, just being able to slam this and make it so their best thing, they just can't swing in with anything good, or else you trade with it. Even if they're in the air, they can't just dodge it by flying overhead like they would with most death touch creatures. They can just, this thing can just block in the air and trade with their best thing, so it makes them not want to swing in. That alone would make this good enough for limited, but it also has this exhaust ability, and that's what makes me consider it even for formats outside of limited, even maybe for standard potentially. I'm not exactly sure which deck it would want to go in, but the exhaust ability is powerful. You pay 4, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal 2 land cards, put those land cards onto the battlefield tapped, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. So it also becomes a 2/2 flyer with death touch, and can maybe start contribute to doing damage and winning the race as well, which is kind of interesting. I just think there's a lot of potential with a card like this, and specifically I'm thinking like the more landfall payoffs there are, the better landfall payoffs you have, the better this card might be, because it can come down and sort of protect you in the interim from any big threats, and then eventually when you have stuff that's going to give you value off of landfall, you can use the exhaust ability, get 2 triggers, and go nuts with your landfall. So there's potential there. I just think this card has a ton of value packed in. But let's get to my actual top 5 for the uncommons. And that starts with Momentum Breaker. 1 black and 1 for an enchantment. It has Start Your Engines. This is number 5 for me. When this enchantment enters, each opponent sacrifices a creature or vehicle of their choice. Each opponent who can't discards a card. And you can pay 2 and sack this enchantment to gain life equal to your speed. This card's insane. This card is so pushed. The fact that you have Tithing Blade, where if you play the Tithing Blade when they don't have a creature or vehicle, and doesn't have anything to hit, they have to discard a card, so it's never dead, it's always relevant, and it's an enchantment, it fuels all your enchantment synergies, it's a permanent, it can be picked up with Nurturing Pixie, it can be sacrificed to Rottenmouth Viper or Braids, all of that stuff is nuts. And then on top of it, it starts your engines. If you need to start your engines, it's got a little backup way built in. Granted, most of those decks are going to want to start your engines on turn 1, but if you haven't yet, having that little bit of extra silver lining is nice. And then on top of that, if you're racing an aggro deck, like a mono red deck or something, it has a built-in way to gain life too. Just pay 2, sack it, gain life equal to your speed. And because you at least gain 1 life because of the start your engines, it also makes this card really good in life gain decks as early removal, because you get rid of their 2-drop or their 3-drop or whatever early on, and then later on in the game when you have things that trigger off of gaining life, you can now sack it for at least 1 life, even if you've never dealt damage to them, because you'll be at speed 1 from starting your engines, and then you'll get to trigger all of your life gain synergies. So everything that this card does is just awesome in a myriad of different ways. The card is just bananas. That being said, it is really dependent on how powerful those decks end up being that want to use it, but I mean, the card is just so versatile and so nuts, and I love it, so it's my pick for number 5, and honestly, after talking about it, I'm starting to wonder if maybe it should be higher, but we're at 5 with it, so let's move on to number 4, which is Memory Guardian. Why is Affinity for Artifacts back in Standard? This is crazy. A 3/4 artifact creature robot artificer for 1 blue and 4. It has Affinity for Artifacts and Flying. So if you have 4 more artifacts, it comes down for 1 blue mana as a 3/4 flyer. That also counts as an artifact and fuels all your other artifact synergies, including your other Affinity for Artifacts cards. That's just crazy. If the Affinity deck is real, this card is a slam dunk 4 of a part of that. Full stop. Card's just nuts. Next up, we've got kind of a 2-card package. I cheated a little bit here, but my number 3 pick is kind of 2 cards because they're very similar. Marauding Mako. Marauding Mako? Is this Mass Effect? Marauding Mako, a 1/1 shark pirate for 1 red mana. Whenever you discard 1 or more cards, put that many +1/+1 counters on this creature, and you can cycle it away for 2 if you get it later in the game. And Scrounging Skyray, which is kind of the same thing, except it costs an extra mana, has an extra toughness, and it flies. But otherwise is exactly the same card. Both of these cards, bananas. Bananas in the discard deck. And when I was putting these spoilers out at first, a lot of people commented that they thought that it's too slow, and it's just going to get removed, or it's going to get bounced, or whatever. And my thought is, if you're wasting your time bouncing my cycling creatures that I can just cycle to trigger all of my other discard payoffs after you bounce them, and you're losing tempo by bouncing them, that's insane for me, right? The discard deck is going to be so real it hurts. It is going to turn the meta on its head. I promise you that deck is going to be insane. I'm not going to say it's necessarily going to be tier 1 right away, but at the very least, it's going to be a tier 1 1.5, a very real deck, and people are going to do a head spin when they see the kind of ridiculous value you can get off of all of the cards that you're discarding. And these creatures are the backbone of it. If you have them in your opening hand, get them down early, start to capitalize with tons of counters as you go about your business. And if they spend their turns dealing with them, cool. That just means they're dragging out the game that much longer for you to get even more of your cycling payoffs, to cycle into even more shenanigans. And the cycling deck likes to go long. The longer the game goes, the more mana they have to cycle more cards each turn. So, yeah, go ahead. Waste your time killing my creatures so that I can build up all the value in the world. These cards are going to be super relevant. Number 2 is Voyage Home. We already talked about Affinity for Artifacts and how insane it's going to be. But this is the one card that's going to be the biggest payoff for the deck that isn't an artifact itself. There are probably some payoffs that are better, that are actually artifacts. But as far as cards that aren't artifacts themselves, this is the number 1. This is Voyage Home, a sorcery for 7 mana, 1 blue, 1 white, and 5. But it has Affinity for Artifacts. It draws you 3 cards and gains you 3 life. This is like Ancestral Recall meets Lightning Helix? Kinda? If you have 5 or more artifacts in play, this is just 2 mana, draw 3 cards, gain 3 life. It's like Ancestral Recall and Lightning Helix had a baby, and it's bananas. Obviously, you need to go wide with artifacts in order to make that happen, but if that's the deck you're building, like, it should be super easy to do that. And even if you can't do it super early, turn 2, turn 3, whatever, you usually don't need to gas up on cards that early in the game anyway. By the time you run out of things to play, you'll have enough artifacts in play that you can play this for 2 mana, theoretically, if you're actually building your deck right. So just drawing 3 cards, gaining 3 life. I love that this card is not dead against aggro. Normally, the problem with cards like this that draw you cards is when you're up against aggro, like, you care a lot less about the card advantage and a lot more about surviving. But the fact that this also gains you 3 life for the 2 mana you're going to spend means it's not dead against aggro. It helps fend off the game from ending maybe a whole other turn, and you draw into more stuff that you might need to deal with what they're doing. Just seems bananas. But the number 1 pick from me for the best uncommon in this set is Molt Tender. 1 green mana for an Insect Druid. It is just a 1/1, but you can tap it to mill a card, and you can tap it, exile a card from your graveyard, add 1 mana of any color. That second ability, absolutely busted in the self-mill Surveil decks, specifically in Insidious Roots. Being able to trigger your Insidious Roots and add a mana of any color at the same time by just tapping this thing that only cost you 1 mana to play on turn 1 is nuts. In the Roots deck, this is better than a Birds of Paradise, literally. And that's crazy, and that's not even counting the fact that you can tap it to mill a card. The fact that it has this extra value built in that you can tap it to mill a card if you're out of gas, or if you just need that one last card to get to Delirium, or that one last card to get to Threshold, or if you need to trigger your Descend for the turn, or whatever the case might be, there's all this silver lining value to be had with it. And then it's really good in Limited too, because of that built-in mill a card ability. Even if you have nothing in your graveyard to make mana with, you can mill a card so that next turn you can make the mana that you need. So it's just good. It's just really, really good everywhere, and I can't wait. I didn't think there was anything that could make me excited to brew Roots again, just because I've played that deck so much that, like, it's just kind of getting old at this point. It's still amazing. It's a great deck. But this card changed all of that, and there are a couple other cards coming in this set as well that makes me really excited to brew with Roots. In fact, at least one of them we'll be talking about a little bit later on. But this guy in particular, absolutely insane. But that brings us to my top 10 of the set. We are going to start with just one honorable mention, and that is Demonic Junker. Because I think it's good, but there's one deck in particular it's going to be absolutely insane with that I plan on building. And so I couldn't put it in the top 10 because it's not good enough all around, I don't think, to really be there. But it's definitely good enough as far as in the way that I'm going to use it. So I had to at least mention it. So this is my honorable mention for the rares and mythics and all of that. My top 10 of the set. So I guess you could say it's kind of number 11. It's the honorable mention. This is an artifact vehicle. It's a 4/3 for 1 black and 6, which seems like a lot. It crews for 2, but it has affinity for artifacts. So you could play it for as low as just 1 black mana. When this vehicle enters, for each player, destroy up to 1 target creature that player controls. If a creature you controlled was destroyed this way, put 2 +1/+1 counters on it. So first, let's talk about all of the fair things you can do with this. If you go wide with a bunch of artifacts, then if you have 6 or more out, this is just 1 black mana, kill any creature they have, their best creature, and hit your own, I don't know, maybe Clockwork Percussionist, so that you get to exile some card advantage, and have a 6/5 vehicle in play that crews for only 2. And that all costs you 1 mana. That's I guess kind of the dream a little bit, right? But regardless, I think there's something to be said there. But where it starts to get even crazier is when you think about it in this context. Imagine just an artifact. Just think of it this way. What if there was an artifact that for 1 black mana killed any creature? And that was it. It was just 1 black mana. When it enters, destroy target creature. How good would that be? And what are some ways that would be good? Because I can think of one, and that way would be blinking it. So we're absolutely going to make a Mardu Nahiri's Resolve deck. I already have a Nahiri's Resolve deck that goes super wide with artifacts and blinks the artifacts to get more ETB value when they come back into play, some of which making token creatures that stick around after we blink the artifacts that made them, which is all awesome. But you could also go wide with those artifacts, play Demonic Junker, kill their thing, and then blink Demonic Junker every turn with Nahiri's Resolve and kill something every single turn. And if you want, you could even kill your own guys. I don't know if those go in the same deck, but the potential for this card to show up in certain archetypes is kind of insane. And I really think it has a high chance of being absolutely nuts if it's used just right. I just love this card. You could even just use it as sacrifice fodder, right? If your sacrifice deck is an artifact deck and you're going super wide with artifacts specifically that you want sacrifice value with, you could sacrifice this. You could sacrifice this to a Rottenmouth Viper. It's just another thing, right? Just a lot of potential. A lot of potential, and I'm excited. But let's get into the meat and potatoes. It's been long enough. This is number 10 for best card in the set, in my opinion. And this one I think is a little bit of a sleeper. Captain Howler, Sea Scourge. A 5/4 legendary creature shark pirate for 4 mana in the colors of Izzet. It has Ward, pay 2 mana, and 2 life. And whenever you discard one or more cards, target creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn for each card discarded this way. Whenever that creature deals combat damage to a player this turn, you draw a card. Okay. This card's insane. And I know what most people are thinking. Dies to removal. Let's compare this to Sheoldred for just a minute. If this comes out the same turn as Sheoldred would, if they both die on your turn, if either one would die on your turn the same turn that you play it, the Howler is better. Because they have to lose the 2 life and pay 2 extra mana, whereas with Sheoldred they don't have to do that to kill it. If we say go, they untap, and then they use sorcery speed removal to kill either the Sheoldred or the Howler. Killing the Sheoldred means they did lose the 2 life for drawing their card, and the Sheoldred is still dead. Whereas killing the Captain Howler means they also paid 2 life, and Sheoldred is dead, but in addition, had to pay another 2 mana as well. So Captain Howler is still a little bit better. And if you survive the whole turn cycle and make it back to your turn with Captain Howler in play, is it as good as a Sheoldred? And that's where things get interesting, because in a vacuum, no. But the ceiling is way, 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 way higher on Captain Howler. If you are in the discard deck and all you're waiting for is just to get back to your turn, and then every single card you discard is beefing up your team and letting you draw extra cards if they deal damage, that's nuts. You can even have it target itself, and it can swing in and be one of the creatures you're attacking with to try to draw a card. If you get to draw any cards off of this thing's triggers, you're winning. But in addition to that, you're going to have other things that are triggering in that deck. Other things that, like the creatures we saw that get +1/+1 counters, all of that stuff is still going to be triggering from discarding as well. So you're getting even more value than just this. But this alone is nuts. So I think this card has the potential to be crazy. And the only thing that really stands in the way of that is just how realistic the cycling deck ends up being, how competitive it ends up being, how consistent and how fast it ends up being. And we're really going to have to just try it out to know for sure. But the potential for this guy to be absolutely insane, and not necessarily on the same level as Sheoldred, because Sheoldred, you don't need other cards in conjunction with it, right? And it can just win by itself. But at least in the same argument, I think, for as crazy. But it really just depends on how good that deck ends up being. It's going to be good no matter what. But if that deck ends up being really good, this guy's going to be bananas. You have to deal with him or it will be game over. That brings us to card number 9. Muruganda Raceway. This one is pretty easy to slip under the radar, I think. This is a land that taps for just a colorless mana. It has Start Your Engine, starting you at 1 speed, and it has max speed. It can be tapped for 2 colorless mana. Now, I know what you're thinking. this card sucks. Why is it in your top 10 list at number 9? Yeah, sure, it can make you 2 mana, but it takes a while to get there, and you don't know for sure if you'll get there, and it's inconsistent. And I've considered all of those things, but the most important part about this card is it's the absolute best card you can play, the best land you can play on turn 1 to ensure that you can have turn 1 speed 2. And it's the only way you can do that is by playing a colorless Start Your Engines land, and then playing a Ginger Brute and swinging in for 1 point of damage with the Ginger Brute's haste. That gets you to speed 2 on turn 1, which means you could get to max speed at the beginning of turn 3 with like a burn spell or something, turn on the ability to make 2 mana with this, and turn on all of your other max speed stuff as well. So, I do have a feeling that there is going to be a Start Your Engines max speed deck, which is not completely colorless, but very leaning towards colorless and splashing maybe 1 or 2 other colors for some key cards that have really good payoffs for max speed and stuff like that, or some additional aggro cards to curve out with. But I think the fact that playing this on 1 with a Ginger Brute is literally the only line in the game that can have you at speed 2 on turn 1 and get you to potentially speed 4 on turn 3, the absolute earliest you could get to speed 4 max speed ever under any circumstances, requires one of 3 cards, one of the colorless lands specifically, that have Start Your Engines, and this is the best one of that, because you get to make up for a little bit of what might be tempo loss by having to play a colorless creature on turn 1, by getting mana out of it starting as early as turn 3 and every turn after that, while also getting all of your other max speed payoffs. So I do think this has the potential to be a part of a very important deck, and I'm going to be testing that deck for sure. The real question of how relevant that deck ends up being is just how well we can balance having enough colorless gas while having all of the best, colored cards still in the deck, and not being held back by the fact that we need to start with turn 1 with a colorless land. So we're going to try it, we're going to experiment, we're going to brew, it's going to be bananas, but this is my pick for number 9 card in the set, specifically because of that. Number 8, Loot the Pathfinder. Now, this is another one that on first inspection I thought wasn't good enough. He's very expensive, but the more you think about Loot, the crazier he gets. 2/4 legendary beast noble with double strike, vigilance, and haste for 5 mana in the colors of Temur. Has 3 different exhaust abilities. For 1 green and tapping him, you can add 3 mana of 1 color. For 1 blue and tapping him, you can draw 3 cards, basically an Ancestral Recall. And for 1 red and tapping him, you can deal 3 damage to any target. Where he gets really insane is with Agath's Soul Cauldron, which I mentioned near the beginning of this video, where if you exile him with the Cauldron, now all of your creatures with +1/+1 counters get these abilities. Every single creature can now Ancestral Recall for 1 mana. Every single creature can now Lightning Bolt someone's face, or their creature, or whatever. Every single creature can now pay 1 tap to add 3 mana. That is insane. And I was still hesitant about including this in my top 10 because, well, that's kind of niche. Outside of that deck, he's still expensive, yada, yada, yada. But then I started to think about that, and I was like, well, he is kind of expensive, but he can get you back the mana the turn you play him. So if you're in a deck where you can just get to 6 mana, you get a 2/4 with double strike, vigilance, and haste that can swing in for 4 damage right away, and then tap and add 3 mana of any color. So effectively, it's like he only cost you 3 mana, right? Because you end up paying 5 for the loot, 1 for the exhaust ability, and then getting 3 mana back. So you really only paid 3 mana for a 2/4 double strike, vigilance, haste on the battlefield that can later on draw you 3 cards for 1 mana, deal 3 damage to something for 1 mana, and that this turn right away, before it even used one of its exhaust abilities, attacked with double strike and hit in for 4. The value left behind, and the 4 damage you can do the turn it hits, and the fact that you can get the mana back right away, all means this guy's better than I first thought, even outside of the Cauldron deck. Now, granted, that still might not be good enough, right? He still might be too expensive. He still probably needs to be in a deck that's going to ramp a little bit to get this guy online while it still matters, when it's early enough in the game where it still matters. There are all of those hesitations and thoughts, but the fact that he's at least better without Cauldron than I originally thought, combined with how busted he is with Cauldron, means he did end up making it onto the list, and I think there is potential for this card, mainly with the Cauldron. But even outside of the Cauldron, he just gives you so much gas if you can manage to efficiently get to the mana you need to play him. But that brings us to card number 7, which is Webstrike Elite. This one's kind of an obvious one. A 3/3 reach creature for 2 is good enough to play on its own. A card where you can pay 2 mana and X to draw a card and kill any artifact or enchantment with mana value X is probably good enough to play. A card that you can pay 2 mana to cycle and draw a card and still destroy an artifact or enchantment token is probably good enough to play. The fact that you get all of those in the same card, and the card can adapt to whatever the situation is whenever you need it to, and be whichever version of that you need, is nuts. And also the fact that it's a cycling ability, so you get to destroy that artifact or enchantment in a way that is uncounterable, since technically it's not counting as casting a spell, makes it even better. And then you think about the fact that this set's bringing so many ridiculously powerful, so much craziness in the form of artifacts to standard, and killing artifacts becomes that much more relevant, and killing enchantments is already really irrelevant because of Duskmourn bringing so many enchantments to the table. When you really start to think of all of the pieces, this card's just amazing. It's amazing at what it does. The question is, the decks that it will go into, are those decks going to be amazing? And I'm not sure how good they'll be. Mono green, specifically Mono green Stompy or mid-range, kinda hasn't proved itself yet, and it's been waiting for just the right set to come along to finally make it worth playing over the aggro decks. Is this set going to be the one to do it? I don't know, but this card definitely helps, and it's super, super good. So that's number 7. Number 6, Riptide Gearhulk. This is a 2/5 artifact creature construct with double strike and prowess for 5 mana in the colors of Azorius, which seems like a lot, until you realize that all of that is extra, because when this creature enters, for each opponent, you put up to 1 target non-land permanent that player controls into its owner's library, third from the top. Now, I talked about this a little bit when I first spoiled this card. This is basically a better Ravenous Chupacabra. It costs 1 more mana, but for that 1 mana, you get an extra 3 toughness, you get double strike, you get prowess, you get it in the perfect colors for flickering and blinking. White and blue are way better for a creature with a removal ability, because you have access to so many blinking spells and ways to just reuse that enters the battlefield ability for really cheap. Whereas in black, you don't really have that. And the removal's actually better. And you could argue that that's subjective, but I think more often than not, being able to take something and put it in their deck instead of in their graveyard, where they can still pull it out with reanimation spells, or, you know, exile it for their insidious roots, or yada yada yada, the list goes on, have ways to interact with that card still. If it's just in their deck and gone, then it's just gone. It's probably the best removal. And now that we're starting to see more and more exile payoffs as well in standard, stuff like 𝐺𝐑𝐄, now it's probably better to do this than even exile something, right? And yeah, so I just think this is all around an amazing card. And then when you add to that the fact that it hits any non-land permanent, not just a creature, that makes it way better than Chupacabra. And it's an artifact. And you know this set cares about artifacts, and there are going to be decks out there that absolutely care about going as wide with artifacts as possible, that this could see a home in. So I just think there's so much about this card that's awesome. And even after it hits the battlefield and gets its trigger and everything, the body is super relevant. That double strike combined with the prowess means that it's kind of double prowess. So it's almost like it's another slick shot. It's expensive, but it's got removal for anything tacked on. So the more you think about the card, the crazier it starts to seem. That being said, it is a little bit expensive, so it's not like a surefire 100% slam dunk. It's absolutely going to be really, really good, but I'm going to put my money where my mouth is, and say that this card is absolutely nuts. And so it's my pick for number 6. But that brings us to the top 5. Number 5 is Lumbering World Wagon. And when I first saw this one, I thought this one was kind of meh too. But then when I started to realize some of the play lines, it became pretty apparent how nuts it was. This is a star power 4 toughness vehicle for 1 green and 2. It crews for 4, which is a lot, but we'll get to that. This vehicle's power is equal to the number of lands you control. Whenever this vehicle enters or attacks, you may search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. So at first inspection, this is, okay, I get an artifact for 3 mana that finds me a land. And then maybe I can get other stuff off of it later on if I can find enough power to crew it. And when you think about it like that, it's kind of like, okay, it's good, but it's not that great. But then you start to think about the kind of decks that are going to use it, and the kind of play lines that are going to line up, and the way things are going to curve out. Turn 1, Land of War Elves. Turn 2, World Wagon fetches you a 3rd land on turn 2. Turn 3, you have 4 lands. You have a Land of War Elf. You play a 5-drop on turn 3. It's definitely going to have 4 or more power. You just play something beastly, use it to immediately crew the World Wagon, which swings, and before they even get a chance to declare a blocker, fetches another land. So now on turn 3, you are swinging with a 5/4 creature, and you have 5 lands in play on turn 3. Someone explain to me a better way to swing with a 5-power creature on turn 3. That just seems crazy. And there are other ways, but all of those other ways do not leave behind any other value. This thing found you 2 lands along the way, which means that even if they kill it, all of those expensive, ridiculously beastly creatures in your hand can easily just start coming down every single turn. You already played 1 on turn 3 to crew this. They kill this. That thing's left behind to do whatever it wants. And then every turn you're just playing gas. This might be the card that puts Stompy back on the map. I really think it has a chance just because of the play lines and the way things can curve out. This card's bananas. I am sorry I underestimated you when I first saw you, but it will absolutely see play. But that brings us to card number 4, my 4th best for the set, which is one of the ones I'm most excited about brewing with. Monument to Endurance. Some people are looking down on this card, and I'm gonna show them why they're wrong. This is 3 mana for an artifact. Whenever you discard a card, choose one that hasn't been chosen this turn. Draw a card, create a treasure token, each opponent loses 3 life. This card's very simple. There are already a ton of really good payoffs for discarding, but this is the best one. But if you can get all of those payoffs, and also these, every cycled card turns into the most insane thing you've ever seen in your life. You can 1 mana cycle something and put counters on creatures and buff up other creatures and turn on the ability to draw cards when you hit and make 2/2 zombie tokens and make a 1/1 bird token and all this other garbage, and then also draw a card or make a treasure token so that you have mana to cycle another thing. And then if you've done both of those things, make them lose 3 life. And then the kicker is you're not limited to doing this once per turn cycle, once per turn. So if you have enough mana to discard 3 things on your turn and discard 3 things on their turn, you get to do it twice every turn cycle. Every turn cycle you're drawing 2 cards, creating 2 treasure tokens, and making them lose 6 life. It's like while they're busy trying to deal with all the ridiculous creatures you have in play and get rid of all of the insane bodies that have stacked up counters and gotten buffs from pirates and all this ridiculousness, you're just draining them out. It's like, spend your turns trying to Sunfall. I don't even need it anymore. Cycle, 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 cycle. You're dead. It's just, all that's left to be seen, all that remains to be seen, is how efficiently the deck can curve out and how realistic it ends up being turn to turn. We know the payoffs are insane. We know the enablers are insane. We just haven't seen it all come together yet. So we're going to build the deck for sure. I think my version's probably going to be Grixis, but we'll talk a little bit more about that when I put out my video talking about the 10 decks I'm most excited to brew during early access, which will be coming soon. This is definitely one of them. This deck's going to be bananas. But that brings us to our top 3. Third best card of the set, in my opinion. Sabsunin, Luxa Embodied. And you might disagree with me on this one. You might think it's too expensive, but again, this is another one where when you start to think about the way things line up and curve out, it gets insane. So Sabsunin Luxa Embodied is a 6/6 legendary creature god for 5 mana in the colors of Simic. She has Reach, she has Trample, she has Indestructible, and at the beginning of your first main phase, you put a +1/+1 counter on Sabsunin. Then, if it has an odd number of counters on it, you draw 2 cards. What's the catch? The catch is Sabsunin can't attack or block unless it has an even number of counters on it, but 0 counters counts as even. So here's how this curves out. First of all, if you're playing this, you're probably playing Llanowar Elves. So this could come out as early as turn 4. Even if you're not in a ramp deck, you're still probably playing that card. You could potentially get this out on turn 4. Which is going to be gross. But even if you play it fairly and get it out on turn 5, this is how it curves out. It comes down. It immediately has no counters and is a 6/6 Reach Indestructible blocker for you. Then, on your next turn, at the beginning of your first main phase, after you untap and draw a card, you put a counter on it. There's an odd number of counters on it, so it draws you 2 cards. That means, even if it can't attack and block that turn, at the very least, this was already kind of the One Ring for you. Now, it didn't make it so that your opponent can't deal damage to you at all. You didn't gain protection from everything like the One Ring, so it's not actually the One Ring. But you do have a 6/6 Reach Indestructible blocker, so their best thing is not getting through for damage, no matter what, the turn that you play it. And then you're drawing 2 cards. Right? So it's like a double Phyrexian Arena and nerfing their best creature, killing their best creature. They might not attack with anything because they're going to lose probably their best creature in the attack even if the other stuff gets through. So it could fend them off from attacking with anything at all, similar to the One Ring. So it almost looks like a standard version of a kind of pared down One Ring. But then it starts to get even crazier when you realize you don't have to lose any life to this like the One Ring. And if you have any way whatsoever in your deck to manipulate the number of +1/+1 counters on it, it just gets even crazier. Because if on your next turn you've already held this up as a blocker, drawn 2 cards, if you could put a second +1/+1 counter on it, well now it's an 8/8 that can attack in if you want, or still block if you want, and draws you another 2 cards next turn. If you could just put 1 counter on this every turn, it draws you 2 cards every turn, and is a scaling, bigger and bigger 6/6 Indestructible Trample threat, or 6/6 Indestructible Reach creature that they do not want to swing into. All of that is insane. This card is so crazy, and nobody realizes how crazy it is. It's just so crazy. You need to start thinking about it in the same terms as the One Ring. And it is not as powerful as the One Ring. Let's get that right out of the way. But it's standard legal. It's about as close as you'll ever get to a One Ring in standard. And I don't know, man. I think the more people start to realize that, the crazier this card gets. Granted, there is some removal that can take it out. You can exile it, right? You can bounce it. But the Indestructible, still a pretty big deal. So I just love this card. I think it's super, super good, and I can't wait to brew with it, for sure. Definitely in some kind of a +1/+1 counter deck. Imagine this with, like, Collector's Cage, or something like that. Man, we're doing the thing. But that brings us to our pick for the second best card in AetherDrift, and that is Howl Squad Heavy. Yes, this card is good enough. Yes, this card is good enough. This is a 2/3 Goblin Mercenary for 1 red and 2. It has Start Your Engines, so if you haven't already, which you probably have, it'll put you at speed 1. Other goblins you control have haste no matter what. That's not just the goblin tokens that you're making, it's all of your goblins. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you create a 1/1 red goblin creature token. That token attacks this combat if able. So you make a 1/1. The 1/1 has to swing. All of that by itself is honestly good enough. It makes this playable. But then they decided to absolutely lose their minds, and WotC was like, let's make it a Priest of Titania 2. At max speed, you tap it and just get a red mana for each goblin you control. It's like, what's that card? Goblin Spelunker? No. Skitterer. Skirmisher. The 1-drop red goblin that everybody uses in Explorer and Pioneer that lets you sack a goblin. Any of your goblins gains the ability to sack to make a red mana. That guy. It's kind of like that guy, except you don't have to sack your goblins to get the mana. And in fact, you don't even have to tap your goblins to get the mana, right? You just get the mana from this one guy. That's insane. This card is absolutely cracked. Goblins are going to be absolutely cracked. And my favorite part about that is the fact that I'm so sick of facing the mono red decks that exist right now as they are on the ladder, just because it's so old. They've been doing it for so long. I'm getting so bored with it. And if all of those people just start playing goblins instead, I'll be so happy. I would love to come up against goblins. It would be so fun. I'm excited to brew it too. In fact, my editor Finn has been begging me to brew a goblin deck for a long time now. And we might even do that before this set comes out. We might try our hand at brewing a goblin deck before AetherDrift hits to see what it could look like right now in the lead up to AetherDrift launching. So keep your eyes peeled for that, because that might drop on the channel soon. But when AetherDrift drops, that deck's gonna be bananas. This guy's crazy. This guy's I don't even know what WotC's thinking. This guy's just completely pushed and nuts. But he's not my pick for the best card in the set. My pick for best card in the set is one that I think a lot of people are going to sleep on at first. And that is 𝑇𝑒𝑟𝑟𝑎𝑛𝑐𝑒, the New Dawn. Yes, I'm serious. 𝑇𝑒𝑟𝑟𝑎𝑛𝑐𝑒 is insane. I know there was a card earlier in this video where we talked about might be a new Up the Beanstalk. 𝑇𝑒𝑟𝑟𝑎𝑛𝑐𝑒 is Up the Beanstalk's crazy older brother. 𝑇𝑒𝑟𝑟𝑎𝑛𝑐𝑒 is insane. 3 mana for a 4/4. 1 black, 1 white, and 1. A legendary creature god with Menace, Lifelink, and Indestructible. 𝑇𝑒𝑟𝑟𝑎𝑛𝑐𝑒 can't attack or block unless there are 7 or more cards in exile. Whenever 1 or more cards are put into exile from graveyards and or the battlefield during your turn, you draw a card and lose a life. So let's think about that for a minute. You're saying every time I cast Ossification, I draw a card. You're saying every time I Leyline Binding, I draw a card. You're saying every time I exile anything at all from the battlefield, I just get to draw a card. All of that removal becomes cantrips? That's crazy. And then you take it one step further and you're like, wait, if I Ghost Vacuum, I draw a card. If I use Agatha's Soul Cauldron, which is already going to be broken in this set, I draw a card. If I'm in the Roots deck and I'm exiling my own creatures every turn, I'm drawing cards. You see where I'm going with this? Everything draws you card. But it doesn't stop there. Here's the part that most people aren't realizing. If my opponent exiles anything, I get to draw a card. If you Ossification something that isn't 𝑇𝑒𝑟𝑟𝑎𝑛𝑐𝑒, I'm drawing a card. Oh my god. If you Sunfall my board before 𝑇𝑒𝑟𝑟𝑎𝑛𝑐𝑒 is a creature, I get to draw a card. Everything you exile, if you're in the Roots deck, I'm drawing a bunch of cards. Like, crazy. This card is crazy. Why don't people realize how crazy it is? And if you're worried about the life loss, eventually, when 7 or more cards are in exile, it becomes a creature. It's indestructible, so you don't have to worry about swinging in. It's Menace, so they even have a hard time blocking it. And most importantly, it has lifelink. So you'll start to gain back 4 life every turn. That's crazy. And it doesn't even just count your cards in exile, it counts your opponent's cards in exile as well. So the more stuff that they exile, the more they help you turn on your 𝐻𝐸𝑅𝑟𝑎𝑛. It's bananas. Everything about this card is bananas. And I do not think people realize just how bananas this is. But they're going to, because we're going to build that deck. There's a few different decks you can build with this. And all of them are going to be bananas. And then we're just scratching the surface, because there's even more you can do with this card. If you flicker anything and it comes back onto the battlefield, you draw. Like, this card is good. This card is really good. It's going to shake up multiple formats. It's going to be one of those cards that just kind of comes out of nowhere, and people don't realize just how impactful it's going to be, and then it's going to be insane. I am going to be brewing around this card day one, 100%, in multiple different ways, in multiple different decks. We're going to do Abzan Roots. We're going to do just a Flicker Blink deck. We're going to do some kind of crazy control deck that just uses all exile removal and uses this as a card draw engine and a win condition. I mean, it's just, this card just does so much, and I love it, and it's amazing. It is my pick for the best card in the set. Maybe I'm crazy, but I think I'm right. But that's going to do it for today. Look forward to my next video where I'm going to talk about the 10 decks I'm most excited to brew and do a little bit more to break them down. I know I mentioned here or there a couple of them throughout this video, but we're going to actually break down like what each of those decks is trying to do and a few of the cards that we're looking to use in those decks, and it's going to be super, super fun. So look forward to that, and be sure to catch me for early access for AetherDrift on Wednesday, February 5th. 24-hour stream, starts at 1 p.m. I'll be playing whatever you guys want to see in action. We'll be trying it out, but I'll mostly be trying to get those 10 crazy deck ideas that I have in my brain up and out there so we can get footage of whooping everyone's ass live and then make YouTube deck tech videos and get them up on YouTube ASAP for all of you guys in case you miss it live. It's just going to be crazy. It's going to be a wild 24 hours. I'll see you there. That's twitch.tv/quarantinecapricorn. Because if I'm alive and I'm breathing, I'm there and I'm streaming. In the meantime, if you're new, please subscribe. And if you're not new, and also if you're new, please like this video. Because it helps me so much. More than you could ever possibly understand. Just do it. Just press the button. And then comment below and say, I pressed the button. And I can just like, do this. So thank you. I'll see you guys tomorrow. This set, man, it's crazy. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck techs, that's somewhere over there. And if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.